Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to see you back in this series of lectures. Just for a moment, I want to remind you where we are. We're speaking about what I have called a revolution in terms of a visual revolution in Jewish life in the modern period. The first lecture, we talked about Moses Mendelssohn, whose name will reappear probably today and next week as well. And then we looked at work by an Orthodox school teacher by the name of Wiesen, whose name will also return here, maybe again next week in some context. Today we're going to talk about something else. We're going to talk about an artist whose name may probably not be known to most of you. What I will be saying today emerges from a book which I published recently with a colleague of mine, Miriam Reiner from Bar-Ilan University. And we've dealt with the issue of Samuel Hirszenberg. Now, Samuel Hirszenberg was a Polish Jewish artist born in 1865. And I want, before we go into Hirszenberg's world, I want to say something general about the issue of dealing with an artist who comes from different traditions. Because artists of Jewish origin are often involved in a tug-of-war of historical reception. They stem from a cultural and political milieu that left its stamp on their artistic creativity in one way or another, and they are at times viewed as part of the pantheon of a national heritage, however elastic and temporary that pantheon may be. Yet another discourse exists that seeks to situate their art within the confines of Jewish creativity or identity, attributing to their Jewish origin works of art that show no obvious or minimal connection to a Jewish source. A wide range of arguments is invoked, sometimes contradictory in nature, to co-opt such works to the domain of Jewish influence, intimating an ideological subtext of a conscious or a subconscious nature. During the artist's lifespan, experimentation with and attraction to changing artistic styles accompanied by inevitable transitions engendered by personal, political, and ideological tendencies impede a monolithic portrayal that gives pride of place to one or the other of these analytical discourses. 19th and 20th century artists of Jewish origin. Now notice I'm using the concept Jewish origin because often we prefer to say Jewish artists, but in a sense these artists were born Jewish, but very often the Jewish element in their lives is minimal, which is not the case with Hirszenberg. And therefore I would say that 19th and 20th century artists of Jewish origin, be they from Western or Eastern Europe, faced a changing national, social, and political context in which their sense of belonging and attachment were often challenged and reorientated. This is evident as one looks, for example, at the work of Camille Pissarro, Simon Solomon, Maurycy Gottlieb, who we will talk about, Mark Antokolsky, who we will meet next week, Isidor Kaufmann, Modigliani, and Max Lieberman, who we'll also meet next week. And this is only to name but a few of the more celebrated figures who both openly confronted their Jewish identity and whose work was in turn the source of conflicting appraisals. Yet at the risk of essentialism or omission, critics need to confront the intersections and inevitable complexity of artists of Jewish origin whose unique minority existence and individualism may or may not have found expression in their diverse subject matter. This lecture, as I mentioned, will be devoted to Samuel Hirszenberg, who was born in 1865, 1908, and here you see him from 1906 in a self-portrait. I will inquire into the manner in which his art was informed by his upbringing and biography, the artistic worlds he encountered in Poland and Munich, and the profound sense of engagement with the dilemmas faced by Polish Jewry at the fin de siècle, at the end of the 19th century. He was born in 1865 in Łódź, Congress, Poland, an industrial city that was on the verge of a major demographic boom. Łódź numbered 50,000 in the census of 1877, whereas 20 years later it had increased more than sixfold, reaching a total of 314,000, a third of whom were Jews. And you look at this thriving textile industry, Łódź therefore attracted a large number of landless peasants and a small number of disenfranchised nobility, which included an influx of Lithuanian Jews from Western Russia and Germans who joined the largest center of German nationals in Congress, Poland. So Yiddish continued to be the mother tongue of over 93% of Łódź Jews, though Russian, Polish, and German began to be spoken by a small number of these Jews. Basically, we're dealing with a working class population. The vast majority of Jews were artisans who worked in small shops and traditional crafts such as tailoring and carpentry. Now, when we look at Hirszenberg's parents, his father was a weaver who struggled to support his large family. The 11th child was born in the late 1880s, as factories were rapidly replacing the employment of artisans. Hirszenberg's father earned a meager salary, guaranteeing a very difficult existence for a large family. Yet an enterprising Jewish bourgeoisie was also present in the city. Some owned factories and were involved in purchasing raw material. One of the most important of these was Israel Poznański, and the family moved to Łódź in 1834 when the town was still in its earliest stage of growth, and gradually they amassed much wealth and purchased land to build a factory and a housing estate for his workers. By the 1870s, he was considered the king of cotton in Łódź and the owner of textile factories in the city, employing some 6,000 workers. His elegant and expansive palace, which we will see during this lecture, glorifying his accomplishment and prominence, is today the city's museum, and it was an integral part of an entire industrial residential complex. It would also be a point of intersection with the Hirszenberg family, as Samuel would be commissioned in the early years of the 20th century to decorate its main hall with various paintings existent to this day. One family's misery was another's success. The industrialization in Łódź that skyrocketed the Poznański family to great riches at the end of the century was partly responsible for the Hirszenberg's difficult economic situation. In response to their declining economic situation, pressure was put on Samuel, as the eldest son, to assist his father and apprentice as a weaver. Unlike the family of his compatriot, Mauritius Gottlieb, who strongly encouraged his artistic talents, Hirszenberg's parents viewed unfavorably his interest in drawing and discouraged this direction. At the age of 11, against his own inclinations, Hirszenberg began to learn his father's trade. However, his faulting health brought him into contact with Dr. Maximilian Cohen, who had a special interest in art, and began to cultivate Hirszenberg's talent and his education as an artist. It was Cohen who succeeded in releasing Hirszenberg from the tutelage of his parents, supported his move at the age of 15 to Krakow to study art. Krakow hosted a much more dynamic setting culturally and ideologically, than his hometown of Łódź. It had a prominent school of fine arts, and the Krakow School of Fine Arts was then under the directorship of Poland's national artist of the day, Jan Matejko. The school had become a major training ground for leading Polish artists of the generation, including Gottlieb, who had passed away at the young age of 23. Hoping to follow in his footsteps in the school where he had studied, Hirszenberg went off to Krakow, a city in Galicia that had received autonomy within the Austro-Hungarian Empire and where Jews lived in full equality since 1868. He remained there for 2 years. He studied with several Polish artists, subsisted on a meager subsidy that he received from supporters in Łódź, but he was taken in by the beauty of the city, with its rich architectural and historical tradition and its attractive Jewish sites, so dramatically different from his native Łódź, and I would say it continues to be very different from Łódź of today. The city, Krakow, and its melange of traditions remained a source of desire for the young artist, who would eventually return 2 decades later at a very difficult moment in his life. In Krakow, he created his student sketchbook, which is presently in the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, that provides remarkable insight into his life in this period and later, as it is an extremely rare personal record of his artistic exploration, which reverberated in his creations years later. The earliest, I'll just show you first the Palace of Poznański, and now we will look at the notebook. The earliest date registered in the notebook is 22 May 1883. The page on the right side is crammed with doodles and inscriptions, revealing some of his thoughts and feelings. Above a detail of an unfinished drawing showing a cloth with its folds, Hirszenberg drew with extraordinary precision Jan Matejko's signature and decorative monogram, adding an elaborate H that referred to his own family name. The large H is decorated in a floral pattern and looms above Matejko's initials, while the Latin dictum sic transit gloria mundi, thus passes the glory of the world, is appended to the side of the page. One wonders if this is to be read as the expression of a young, driven artist who imagines himself assuming a place among the great Polish artists, or, alternatively, if it recalls the anti-Semitic remarks made by Matejko several months before the opening of the school year. Hirszenberg drew on the same page a partial image of a soldier wearing a helmet, echoing characters from Polish history in Matejko's work. He also includes the name of one of his teachers. Matejko's monogram may signal that the young student was seeking here his own signature as an artist, aspiring to the fame of his illustrious mentors. Additional pages of the notebook are filled with drawings of Krakow's historic quarter of Kazimierz, an area that might well have appealed to Hirszenberg's Jewish sensitivities. He found in Stanislaw Debicki, a fellow student, and a kindred spirit with whom he roamed the streets of Kazimierz, sketching Jewish types, women, street vendors, and old picturesque houses in the district. Both Hirszenberg and Debicki were joined by another Polish student, Marian Warczeniecki, who was a full praise for both of these artists. They shared friendship, common interests, and they, of course, were aware of the animus of Matejko's feelings. The sketchbook reflects impressively the scope of Hirszenberg's gaze while he's in Kazimierz, the very central area within Krakow. His artistic inquiry extended well beyond Jewish topics. Many ordinary people, workers, women with children, and passers-by make their appearance. One further group of images depicts an urban environment in which young men and women are shown as couples. Perhaps these were modern figures represented for Hirszenberg, a world in which he was, as an artist and an individual, could identify. By then, and probably even before arriving in Krakow, he had discarded traditional Jewish observance. He was at home in the Polish language. He could freely follow his burgeoning intellectual interests. His weekly timetable, which I will show you here, includes the Sabbath. And in this weekly timetable, we can see the initial stage of his studies in Krakow. He notes down everything in Polish and affirms his direction. He designated set hours for the study of the French language, history, philosophy, and the Bible. Religious practice is absent from the schedule, whereas physical exercise, chess, and music are clearly noted. But by the end of 1882-1883, Hirszenberg felt that his artistic development demanded a change of place. The years in Krakow brought him into contact with leading and promising Polish artists, the heritage left by Gottlieb, Kazimier's Jewish essence, anti-Semitic currents, and an immersion into the study of history and Jewish culture. Hirszenberg felt ready to move on. He had matured in terms of his inner and artistic life, and he was now well equipped to forge a career on German terrain. Now, in 1883, Hirszenberg follows the route of many Polish artists to Munich, one of Europe's leading centers of art during that period. Its Academy of Art, which was then headed by Alexander Wagner, a distinguished artist of historical themes, would be Hirszenberg's advanced artistic education until 1888. Though he continued to struggle in Munich for his existence, suffered periods of illness, hunger, and outright despair, he became deeply attached to the city and returned there on several occasions in the next 2 decades, and where he would eventually meet his wife, and we'll come to her later on. In Munich, he came of age and began exhibiting works during these years in several venues in each of the cities he had trained. Themes that were to remain central to his oeuvre appeared in several works during this period, prior to a short period when he goes to Paris. 2 of these works reflect Hirszenberg's struggle with the Orthodox world he encountered in his childhood. The painting that you see in front of you was dated 1887. It is a study of 5 Jews burning the night oil in their study of Talmud, in a typical genre scene that attracted the attention of many artists of Jewish origin in the 19th and 20th centuries. But the portrayal that we see here is mixed with fascination, maybe, but strongly with rejection, and to a certain extent with a feeling of melancholy. It brings together the figures in the corner of a small room, seated around a table near a window with a curtain. The morning light already penetrates the room. The students seem to be exhausted from the night's study. One, as you see, has given in to his fatigue. He's fallen asleep on the table, while his colleagues seem still awake, though far from deeply engaged in their study. The elderly man, probably their teacher, leans on his hand that rests on the open Talmud, as his mind drifts off to distant thoughts, losing contact with the study and his students. Moreover, if you look closely, you will see that he is holding under the table what we can assume is an external book, not part of the religious education. The painting offers a poignant comment on the world of Jewish learning. It shows the energy and stamina needed to preserve the rigor of study, but it lacks involvement, it lacks enthusiasm, and it lacks hope. In this sense, the painting veers from the typical genre imagery while asserting Hirszenberg's turn to realism. Now, I just want you to see how he is related in this painting to the very, very well-known painting by Gottlieb, presently in the Museum of Tel Aviv. And here you can see in the detail from Jews praying in the synagogue on the Day of Atonement of 1878, and probably at some point Hirszenberg had seen this and used aspects from the painting in his own work. While he was thinking of his relationship to Jewish tradition, he moves in a different direction. He embarks on the first of his historical paintings. Unfortunately, the painting is lost, and it's called Uriel da Costa and Spinoza. Perhaps this was inspired by Wagner, perhaps it was inspired by Gottlieb's interest in da Costa, and we'll talk more about this the next time. Hirszenberg offers a new angle to their engagement with these celebrated Marano figures. Both figures went against the grain of traditional Jewish society. They battled basic Jewish beliefs and brushed against the oligarchy of the Amsterdam rabbis. Da Costa, 1585-1640, was excommunicated on several occasions in Amsterdam, Venice, and Hamburg. And Spinoza, in 1656, by the Mahamad in Amsterdam for what were considered heretical beliefs. Da Costa committed suicide in 1640, seemingly unable to overcome the sense of humiliation following the degrading ritual he was forced to undergo to annul his excommunication. Both Spinoza and Da Costa were the source of recurrent interest, especially, as we will see in the next lecture, in the 19th and 20th century among playwrights, authors, composers, and artists of non-Jewish and Jewish origin. Here we see an artist creating a historical scene. An artist, not like historians, don't have to be observant of what actually happened. In other words, here he creates an intimate connection between Da Costa and Spinoza. He has Da Costa, the elderly figure, is sitting in an intent position, wearing a black skull cap, crouched over the little boy as he gazes penetratingly into the distance in an intense, almost haunted fashion. He holds the dreamy-eyed Spinoza with golden hair, aged 8 or 9, dressed in fancy clothing. Da Costa is bearded, as you see. The open book on the table, a reminder of a lesson on natural science that Da Costa was apparently giving Spinoza, is clearly not on Da Costa's mind. Indeed, his compelling look contrasts sharply with Spinoza and his comportment, intimating the hope invested in the child, who eyes the flowers from the corner of his eyes. Similar to the physical setting in the yeshiva painting that we saw before, the Spartan room is bare, save the books strewn on the tables and on the shelf. In the spirit of historical works of art, as I mentioned, Hirszenberg was not concerned with historical accuracy. You could ask me, did Spinoza and da Costa ever meet? Well, Spinoza was only 8 years old when da Costa died. And there's no historical evidence whatsoever that attests to a meeting between the two outcasts. So, in a sense, you could say that what is happening here is that Hirszenberg is creating a spiritual lineage between the two, intimating that Spinoza was da Costa's disciple. And I would add, probably creating a genealogy of Jewish freethinkers. And he affirmed their symbolic significance to Jewish culture. It would appear then that he was expressing his support for their direction and struggle against the rabbis. Now, his involvement and engagement in Jewish themes remained a central preoccupation in his work. And here you can see the way he, again, probably knew the work of Gottlieb, uses the same kind of contact between da Costa and his lover. And you see here Spinoza with da Costa, and his involvement and engagement with Jewish themes remained central, even though he was doing other works and inspired at some point by his short 10-month stay in Paris. And there he tried his hand at different forms of creativity, as you see here, a painting that he does of Lutomirsk in 1890, and then a very beautiful painting in the Museum of Art in Lodz, a woman doing embroidery. He was trying to find a way to express himself in different worlds and attracted to Impressionism and other forms of art. But the family situation necessitated Hirszenberg's return to Lodz. And so he felt that he had to return to Lodz after he had spending a short period in Paris, and there he began again to encounter the world from which he descended. Now, in 1890, coming back to Lodz, he creates a family situation in a small and intimate oil painting, commonly entitled Sabbath Rest. In spite of the free brushstrokes and Impressionists' pinks and grays, the atmosphere is somber, and it dominates the mood of the canvas. It shows a traditional Jewish family, bearded men with their heads covered, women, and a child. The bare walls and the sparsely furnished room clearly allude to their poverty, while their heavy clothes and closed window allude to the cold and unpleasant environment that they inhabit. They all seem to be engrossed in deep thought, either due to what is being read to them by the young man in the center of the canvas, or by the outside world, and I hope you can see this, that is conveyed by the images of the large cotton factories that are seen through the window, and as if those large factories are impinging on them. Now, just take a look at this. We have here, standing next to the window, looking very melancholy, a young woman, and it's as if she is conveying to all of us a foreboding presence. Even the young child who rests on the elderly man lends little cheer to the scene. And none of the figures turn their gaze to the female figure lying in bed, either ill or tired. Is this Hirszenberg's family? Is this a way in which he understands the situation of, without actually thinking that these people are members of his family? What is clear is that Hirszenberg is conveying to us a sense in which, in this time in Lodz, 1890, when factories are growing and impeding upon the work of the weaver, of the artisans, of the people who are working for these large factories, Hirszenberg's family scene, and I put this in quotations, his family scene evokes little room for optimism, little room for faith in the ability to face modern adversities. Now, when you think and you look at this Sabbath scene and the harshness that it conveys, one has to look somewhere else. And that is another family scene done many years before Hirszenberg's in 1860. But this was done by the German Jewish artist Moritz Oppenheim, which is presently in the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. Now, just looking at this family Sabbath rest, you can see that we have almost the total opposite feeling that we had when we were looking at Hirszenberg's family scene. We have more or less the same number of people. If this is a Sabbath rest, then it's hard to put it together here. Indeed, the father is resting. A young man has come into the house. The young girls are maybe attracted to him as he speaks. The young brother is maybe reading something. And when we look out the window, we don't see anything which is very sharp. We don't see anything which in any way seems to challenge or be a source of problems for the family. The family is able to sit quietly and enjoy the Sabbath rest. And you see also on the table, you see a challah, you see a wine cup, you see books and so on, sidurim. There is nothing of this in Hirszenberg's. In that sense, the fact that the window is open here, very different from what we see in Hirszenberg's painting, where the window is closed, shut. And so there's something welcoming in Oppenheim's work. It's very different from the figures that we saw in the painting by Hirszenberg. And I just wanted to take a look at these for a moment before we're going to see what Hirszenberg will later do with this Sabbath rest. But just take a look for a moment and try to compare these two works. Probably, and I would assume maybe even more than probably, Hirszenberg did have a notion of what Oppenheim had done. He probably had seen his work in some context. I mean, we're speaking about an artist who's trying to find his way, and so when he is creating Sabbath rest, he's probably looking for work done by other artists, and the work by Oppenheim was well known. So when Hirszenberg creates his version of the Sabbath rest, it appears that the family, as many Eastern European Jewish families of the period, were in the family, and others were in disorder. There was extensive migration to the West, and it was a common goal for many. And Lodz itself was in a state of upheaval. In May 1892, its industrial growth, which you'll remember from what I said at the beginning, the number of people that have come into the city, the industrial growth erupted in a massive strike of industrial workers, carpenters, construction workers, artisans, and others, and a pogrom of the Jews. Many homes and stores were robbed and smashed, and street fights broke out between non-Jews and Jews. So Hirszenberg comes back to Lodz after being Krakow, Munich, Paris, comes back to a city which is changing dramatically, but also in time of flux. So 4 years later, he creates a new version of the Sabbath rest. Now look carefully what has changed. He's added certain details. He has changed somewhat the characters in the family setting. Dina Hirszenberg, his wife, whom he married in 1896 in Munich, she is a convert from a French Catholic family. She noted that the young man sitting beside the window is reading from a brochure to the rest of the family. And she called this the letters from Argentina, from which various scholars attribute the name of the painting, and that's why I have it here in brackets. The painting now, in its new version in 1894, clearly includes 3 generations. The woman in the bed is old and sick. A young child leans on an elderly man. 2 middle-aged individuals are seated at the table, while possibly their 2 grown children are closest to the window. The artist also added what we saw in Oppenheim's painting. He adds something to give a sense that it really is the Sabbath. He adds the Sabbath candlesticks on the table and a hanging Judenstern lamp, which further stresses the ties to Oppenheim's painting and lending the home more clearly, I would say, its Jewish ambiance. But he also does something else. You can see carefully on the wall something which was not present before. You see 2 portraits. They did not appear in the 1890 version. In a sense, trying to enliven the otherwise bare interior. But here you can see very clearly the sad face of the women standing at the closed window. If we look at the figures, one of them can be identified as Baron Maurice de Hirsch. He established the Jewish colonial organization in 1891, which creates a link between the brochure being read and the upheaval in Jewish life in Eastern Europe at this time. The smaller portrait may relate to a relative of the family, but clearly by adding these elements, Hirszenberg skillfully converted a simple genre scene into a programmatic work, treating it one and the same time, the upheaval that was taking place within Jewish life. And therefore I brought to you also this caricature of the Jewish colonization company Unlimited that you see there walking, and the figure at the beginning of that group is once again being a portrayal of the Baron de Hirsch. So while he is trying to understand the developments within Lodz Jewish Society, he goes and does something else. He has a large canvas portraying the Jewish cemetery. This is presently in the French Museum, the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire de Judaism in Paris. But look closely at what I'm showing you here together. On the one hand, you have the oil painting, the Jewish Cemetery of 1892, which is a very large painting, and it depicts a historic Jewish cemetery focusing on women in a non-traditional manner, I would say, and possibly representing the sense of tragedy facing Jewish families. He was I would claim that he was not relating to a specific historical event, but to the sense of dislocation that was the lot of many in those years. He evoked in the painting the pain of these individual women, merging their mourning and personal sadness with the memories of former generations. It was, in a sense, this link with the past and associations with the predicament of contemporary Jews that lent the painting its public attraction at the turn of the century. And I'm bringing you, once again, an image from the notebook of 1883, where you see that already then, walking through Krakow, seeing the cemetery in Krakow, he made some reference to a Jewish cemetery. And therefore you can see here someone digging the grave and the stones nearby. So in a sense, this was something which was very much with him, and the notebook continues to be a source of continuation, showing why and how Hirszenberg was thinking about these images, these paintings early on. I mentioned that he gets married in 1896, and to a woman who comes from a different tradition, never learns Polish, never learns Yiddish. Their language, seemingly together, is French. Remember, as I showed you earlier on in the notebook, Hirszenberg was studying French when he was in Krakow from 1883. And while he comes back after he goes to Munich in 1896, where he meets his wife, he comes back to Lodz. Now take a look at this painting. Now this painting has haunted me, I must admit. It is presently in the museum Ein Harod in the north of Israel. It depicts an Orthodox Jew draped in a large talit, deep in contemplation, sitting alone in front of a single candle. Listlessly, he holds an open book on the table, but his eyes seem to be more directed to the burning candle than to the book's apparent content. Someone else who maybe was in the service with him has put his talit on the table, strewn it on the table, left disorderly, and he's now absent, leaving this Jew alone in his solitude. And the atmosphere in the room of this symbolist painting is dominated, I would claim, by a framed shadow of a figure, and look carefully, which appears to his right. It may be at the heart of the musings of this seated figure. He seems to be oblivious to its presence, but it's clear that Hirszenberg wanted to create a certain kind of contact between this Orthodox Jew draped in a talit and this figure. We are now outside observers, we're left with a feeling of uncertainty that seemed to be also his. What was the imaginative relationship that Hirszenberg created between the figure of the shadow and the Orthodox Jew? Possibly the sense of history and memory that it evoked. It was a painting in a period of transition in his life, a much more personal expression than those works that he spoke of, which we will see later on, The Wandering Jew and Exile. The seated figure seems to be involved in such a process, wondering about the traditions he and others have abandoned, like the talit left behind on the table, and what will be preserved or transpire by the time the burning candle, Judaism, comes to its end. It were as if this Orthodox figure is at the threshold of the past and ruminating about the future, possibly symbolized by the shadow of a figure in front of him. Was this a comment on his part of his own personal odyssey, pondering his distancing from tradition in which he was born and the future with a woman from another tradition who may lighten up his life instead of the dwindling candle? What was to follow after this very engaging painting of 1897 was his Wandering Jew of 1899 that confronted his preoccupation with various encounters with anti-Semitism on different occasions and his perennial feelings of Jewish fragility. It starkly brought together the tradition of Polish realism in art and a Jewish portrayal of an endless struggle with Christianity. You see in the center of two long aisles of crosses, more than twice his height, a Jew wearing a loincloth, gazing starry-eyed, en face, trying to emerge from the valley of death, to escape the fate of other Jews, whose dead bodies are strewn on the ground naked. The Wandering Jew here, a Christ-like figure, has avoided the fate of Jesus on the cross, but the fate of his people has become perilous. He raises one hand while the other covers his forehead, avoiding the sharp light that shines on him. His penetrating gaze, the look of a madman, reveals to the onlooker what moments of terror and destruction he has seen, how he has wandered through the wreckage of Jewish history and miraculously escaped, but only physically. He leaves the dark, eerie field as a solitary figure with no possessions and without a clear sense of the future. Sadly for me, the painting is seldom shown in the Israel Museum, possibly because it's a very large painting and it's not always clear where it can be shown. Now, I think that Hirszenberg, while he was in Munich, most probably saw this work, an amazing work which I don't have much time to talk about. This is the work by Wilhelm von Kaulbach, The Destruction of Jerusalem by the Emperor Titus, 1841 to 1846. Kaulbach presents the burning of Jerusalem, the exile of the Jew from the city by the demons, as seen in the bottom left side of this huge painting. And this must have clearly shaken Hirszenberg and directly inspired his work. Because here you see how Hirszenberg rejected Kaulbach's interpretation by turning the legendary offender of Christ into a victim and a martyr of Christian persecution. This may indeed have been one of the important iconographic sources for Hirszenberg, though the artist was probably aware as well of other works like Gottlieb's Ahasuerus and Gustave Doré's The Wandering Jew. But whatever may be the inspiration for Hirszenberg's Wandering Jew, the painting powerfully confronts Christian interpretations of the legend of the Wandering Jew and places the onus for Jewish wandering, suffering, and sacrifice on Christianity. In attributing the cause for Jewish victimization to a clear source, unlike Gottlieb, Hirszenberg showed no ambivalence about the meaning of the figure of Ahasuerus. In this sense, he asserted a more traditional interpretation of the lachrymose approach to Jewish history. Indeed, Hirszenberg's painting became a Zionist icon in the first generation of the movement. Boris Schatz, the founder of Bezalel in 1906, where Hirszenberg comes a year later, Schatz hangs the Wandering Jew in a central location, which is not the case at the moment in the Israel Museum. He hung the Wandering Jew in a central location and often stood with distinguished figures in front of that painting. Hirszenberg's social realism fit Schatz's vision and may have contributed to the fact that he was invited to come to Bezalel in 1907. Here you see him standing with Schatz, standing with the Chada'am in 1911, probably before the painting. Now, the Wandering Jew did not put an end to Hirszenberg's exploration of the Jewish dilemma. But in the following years, this is after 1899, he paints a series of landscapes and works on a commission for the Poznański Palace in Lodz that were the works which were completed in 1903. Here you see the main dining room of the Poznański Palace. Here you see allegorical works that gave pride of place to the wealth and the power of the patron, to Israel Kalman Poznański. And in this glamorous setting, Hirszenberg creates these murals. And you can see that he has to leave his Jewish interests and he moves into a totally different area. And you can see this in these works where these are all, the murals are depictions by Hirszenberg, which are put into the dining room, showing, of course, how he tries to work with what the family wanted to express about Poznański's coming into Krakow and so on and so forth. And what Hirszenberg does do, as he allows himself to think, to use his wife as a model for some of his murals, which are in the Poznański Palace. But we should say that Hirszenberg, like Jewish artists before him, is constantly trying to figure out and struggles with Christ and his meaning for Jews and Judaism. We have at least two images of Christ that Hirszenberg created, and both concentrate on his head, and they're seen in profile. In one, Christ appears as an Orthodox Jew with a beard and skull cap, and another, in pastel, he appears with a small goatee and a long coiffed hair without a skull cap, closer to Christian images of Jesus. Christ appears here as with a visionary gaze. And Dina, his wife, wrote harshly in her memoir of Hirszenberg and of Christianity's treatment of Jews over time. She did not hold him back from negatively portraying Christianity in The Wandering Jew. In fact, in her description of the painting, she poetically gave voice to its historical implications. The depiction of Christ is significant in its relationship to the Wandering Jew and then to his dramatic depiction of Jewish exile. a painting which he had worked on for several years, unfortunately lost, seen the last time in a German museum, in the Jewish Museum in Berlin in 1938, and has since been lost. Here we have a dramatic depiction of exile. And Hirszenberg appears to be trying to comprehend how the visionary leader, once an Orthodox Jew, could have left behind such a trail of sadness for his former brothers. Indeed, unlike Gottlieb, who constructed his Jesus as a bridge between Judaism and Christianity, Hirszenberg offered a more questioning approach to Christ and his legacy, and therefore passionately throwing himself into exile. In the painting which he created from 1899 to 1904, one can see Jews of all ages and social positions, men, women, and children, a cross-section of East European Jewry at the dawn of the 20th century, making their way through the freezing snow to an undetermined destination. They are going westward. They represent individual worlds, contrasting ideologies. Just look at the various figures that you see in front of you. But their fate as Jews has made them a collective mass. And an elderly Jew with a long white beard, bent over, his hands crunched to his chest to stay warm. He is leading them. And then another elderly man leaning on a walking stick arouses associations with the wandering Jew. Amidst this throng of individuals, most of them seem to be engaged in deep thought, as if they were carrying with them their personal burden and history. Time did not allow them but to take the most essential and holy belongings. We see a Sefer Torah carried by an elderly man with documents and a prayer shawl, another holding a Sefer Torah wrapped in and a young girl holds a tea kettle. The artist includes, and you see in the middle, one figure taller than the others. He included his wife amidst the group. Exile may have been relating to one or another iconographical source, but the historical context determined its contours. Jews were on the move. Hirszenberg could not have been oblivious to the outpouring of emotions and deliberations among his fellow Jews following the infamous Kishinev pogrom on 6th of April, 1903. Was exile a response to the unfolding historical crisis of East European Jewry? As social realism was at the heart of the artist's language, it appears that the general malaise occasioned by these recent events led to his cry from the heart, his cri de coeur. This interpretation takes into account Dina's memoir, which does not relate to any specific event as the catalyst, but portrays vividly the ambiance of the painting and emphasizes its ability to capture the essence of the Jew's fate through history. He completes Exile in 1904. It's exhibited in several venues in Poland, London, and Berlin, and it had a remarkable reception. It came to reflect the history of Jews wandering since the destruction of the temple. And as we remember from the recent Tisha B'Av, it also came on the eve of even more cataclysmic events for East European Jewry. The revolution of 1905 was to have a dramatic impact on Jewish life, politics, and culture. The Hirszenbergs were apparently still in Lodz during these revolutionary days. Now, as time is coming short and the family moves from Lodz to Krakow, returns to Krakow, I want you to just take a look at some of these images which he creates of portraits of friends in different situations. And then we should take another quick look at what's going to happen in the latter years in Hirszenberg's life when he moves from Krakow accepts the position in Palestine and comes to the Bezalel Museum. And when he comes there, he returns to something which had preoccupied him years before. Just before he comes to Palestine, you can think that he is thinking, what am I going to find in this country? Who will I see? And then he brings together this amazing image of Spinoza walking in the streets. This is before he comes to Palestine. And 10 Jews are in the background. One is about to pick up a stone and throw it at Spinoza. 9 looking very unpleasant, sort of frightened by the fact that we have in front of us this figure who is oblivious to what we're living in. He is reading a book, another book under his arm. They are 9. But there's a 10th figure who is not part of them. It's as if Spinoza has created a separation between the 9 and the 10th. And you wonder, the 10th figure who is standing there in front of the door, what does he feel? Do I want to be part of the 9, or do I want to be with Spinoza? In this sense, you could see that the excommunication of Spinoza of 1907 brings us back to the setting, which was so central in terms of his mind. And then he comes to Bezalel. We see him sitting here next to Boris Schatz. And we have to realize that when he comes to Palestine, comes to Jerusalem, he's not in good health. And yet the 11 months that he resides in the city, one can see a major change in his artistic language and concerns. He leaves behind the cultural and ideological struggles that shaped his art for over 2 decades. His imagination wanders into new directions. Images of the Temple Mount from different observation points, showing his fascination with the Mediterranean light, landscape, and floral aspects. Portraits of Jews and Arabs replace the embattled life that Hirszenberg had depicted. Dina's memoir records the transformation the artist sensed during these months, how he was swept up in his new surroundings, treks up to the Mount of Olives, his immersion into the smells, sounds, and sun of Jerusalem. However, his health caught up with him, and on the 14th of September 1908, he passed away. And just before he passed away, we see this image of Moses, very rare in Hirszenberg's creation. And we see also stigmata emerging from his hand. Stigmata, of course, relating to Christ. And in the background, Jews or figures who are crossing the world, crossing the river. In a sense, you can say that this figure of Moses, which in some way looks very similar to an elderly Hirszenberg, is something which is very concerned with towards the end of his life. And therefore, unfortunately, early on, a young man, his personal life had taken an extraordinary turn during these last months, but his legacy lies in the last resort in his piercing attempts to interpret the predicament of the Jews at the turn of the century. But I will leave you here with Moses standing separate from those who were leaving Egypt, crossing the river. But remember that there is stigmata emerging from his hands. Thank you very much. I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Good evening.